Honor Club, where honor is real.
What's up, wrestling fans? Welcome to episode 6 of Old School in Session. My name is Kevin Eck, and it is my distinct pleasure to introduce the Ring of Honor Director of Operations and a former promoter for WCW, the NWA's Georgia Championship Wrestling and Jim Crockett Promotions, and the AWA. He is the man who makes old school cool, and he's also the longest tenured judge in professional wrestling. He is Gary Juster. Gary, how are you?
I'm doing well, Kevin. Thank you. I did not realize I was the longest tenured judge, but if I will accept your research.
Yeah, I was going to say, I believe that's an unofficial. That's unofficial on my end, but I did do a little research. As everyone knows, you were a judge in the ROH Pure Title Tournament, which just concluded, and you were also a judge way back in. It was either 1989 or it was 1988, I believe. The very first Clash of the Champions, Sting versus Ric Flair. You were one of the 3 judges. So that goes back over 30 years. I can't imagine there's a longer tenured judge than yourself.
Yeah, and that was in Greensboro, that Clash of the Champions. And I voted for Sting, as you might remember. And on the way out of the arena, Ric Flair saw me and screamed and yelled at me for doing that.
Did he?
We were still in the kayfabe era, but I think I might have told you this story before. We were in the kayfabe era, but the promotion broke kayfabe in a way that I thought they didn't have to do. There were 3 judges for that match. It was Sandy Scott and Patty Mullen, a Penthouse pet, and myself. And they actually told us how to vote, and which meant smartening up, breaking kayfabe to Patty Mullen, the Penthouse pet. And I thought that all they had to do was let Sandy and I vote, let her vote first, and then Sandy and I could vote accordingly and get the finish that we wanted. So that was the day that kayfabe died for me. The day kayfabe died.
Wouldn't it have been funny? Wouldn't it have been funny if Patty Mullen, the Penthouse pet, had gone into business for herself and voted for Sting instead of Ric Flair, as she was instructed to do? Wouldn't that have been something?
We would have had a new world champion.
Yeah, we would have had a new world champion. Well, luckily for the ROH Pure Title Tournament, there were no Penthouse pets or Playboy models. We were much more credible with yourself and Will Ferrara and Sumi Sakai. So, and the judges only had to render 1 decision, and I think you guys did a fine job.
Thank you, Kevin.
Well, today is a special episode. The previous episodes, we've always devoted it mainly to one subject, in addition to maybe taking a couple questions. But we want to devote this episode to asking you the kayfabe era questions. Hashtag Ask Gary on Twitter is how the questions can be submitted, also on ROH's Facebook page. So, Gary, you ready to take a few questions today?
Sure, go ahead, Kevin.
Okay, this first question comes from Nick, and he asks, can you tell us how Black Saturday affected you when Vince McMahon purchased Georgia Championship Wrestling? Gary, before you answer that, I'm going to add on to his question a little bit and just ask you, did you have any inkling? Did you hear any rumbling that this was going to happen, or were you completely blindsided? And do you recall how you were informed of it?
No, I wasn't blindsided. I knew it was going to happen because I had been in business with Georgia Championship Wrestling and Ole Anderson being the booker and the person who ran the company. So I knew from Ole that this was going on, and they were trying to fight it. And they tried to fight it in court, and they lost. Ole maintained that he and Ralph Freed, the 2 partners that remained that did not sell out to Vince, had a buy-sell agreement which gave them the right of first refusal for any offers to buy the company. Somehow that did not hold up in court. According to Vince's lawyer, the late John Taylor, who I actually got to know and like. I later asked John how it happened that buy-sell agreement was not upheld. And John, who was a very good lawyer and had a sense of cockiness about him, said, frankly, they were out-lawyered. That was John's reaction to it and his analysis. But yeah, so I did know it was coming. It was still rather shocking anyway. But yeah, knew it was coming, and it affected me greatly. We had started promoting in Baltimore in '84 with our Georgia Championship Wrestling. We were doing quite well. As you and I have talked about on this show and many other times, it was something new for Baltimore and for fans of the WWF from way back. That's all they'd ever seen. So we brought them a different product, which Baltimore very much embraced. And it kind of threw us into a tizzy when the sale happened. So Ole and Ralph started a new company called Championship Wrestling from Georgia. And we ran shows with them in August, I believe, in October. And then we kind of gravitated over to Jim Crockett. Ole had joined forces with Jim Crockett, introduced me to him. And around that same time, I got to know Jim Crockett because Pro Wrestling USA was starting in early '85, and or actually in '84, and we were working with a bunch of promoters. And I got to know Jim Crockett then, and my promotion in Baltimore changed pretty radically. It went from working with Jim Crockett to working with Vern Gagne and Pro Wrestling USA to going back to a combination of Jim Crockett and Vern Gagne, then to Crockett, and then finally to WCW.
When Championship Wrestling from Georgia was first formed, and you started promoting those shows, I don't think I've ever asked you this before, but was there a drop-off in attendance?
Yes, there was. There was a drop-off. It wasn't that significant. Business was still pretty good, but we had kind of our strongest attendance in '84 was Ric Flair's first appearance against Jack Briscoe in April of '84. That did 6,000 paid. We never did a really horrible house in '84, even with Championship Wrestling from Georgia, but it did go down.
Yeah, and not to disparage anybody who was on those shows, but I know that at that point, guys who were maybe names in Georgia but didn't necessarily translate to the Baltimore market, guys like Ted Oates, Jerry Oates, I think Ron Slinker was a guy who came in and did some dates, Rip Rogers, the Hustler. I think it was just only – I don't think it was that far-fetched to think that, business was going to drop off a little bit. But it did, as you said, it did build back up when you started bringing in the Crockett guys and Vern's guys. And that leads us right into our next question, which is in those early days of having 3 matches from the AWA and 3 from the NWA, how did payoffs work in this format? Was that handled through you or Vern Gagne and Jim Crockett, and was it a source of contention with the boys?
I handled the payoffs myself in those days. I wrote the checks. I did it, though, in consultation with Vern and Jim Crockett, and often they disagreed. So it was the source of contention was really not so much with the talent as much as it was between Vern Gagne and Jim Crockett. They had different ways of running their business, different ways of looking at it, different ways of booking. They were just different in virtually every way. So I would go through, the talent, and back in those days, the main event got a significantly bigger payoff than anybody else on the card. If it was the NWA champion, of course, they got a formula. It was, I believe it was 9%, 3% to the NWA and 6% to the champion. And then it was kind of based on the St. Louis formula, where the main event just got the big payoff. Semi wind up, of course, got the next best payoff, and then it went down pretty significantly after that. But yeah, it was something that I would do a draft. I would send it to Jimmy and to Vern. They would give me their comments. They'd mark it up. We'd argue a little bit, and then I would do the payoffs.
Just to follow up on that a little bit, anytime there have been promoters working together, it seems this is just a broad question, but just your take on it. Doesn't it seem like more often than not, it just it might start off with the best of intentions, but doesn't necessarily hold up for the long run. That eventually they just can't work together.
In my experience, it never held up even in the short run.
Yeah,
it was always, there were always splits right from the start. As you know, the Pro Wrestling USA effort was a stop Vince McMahon effort, so to speak.
Right.
Anya, Crockett, Watts, Fritz, the Florida office, and Jerry Jarrett from Memphis. And it splintered off very, very quickly, and it ended up basically with Vern and Jimmy and Eddie Einhorn, who was working with Vern. And then after that, it was really just Vern and Eddie Einhorn. And and we did some shows in Baltimore that were just Pro Wrestling USA shows, but they were mainly Vern's talent. And those were no disrespect intended to Vern, who at one time had a great promotion, but it was the waning days of the AWA. And those were our poorest houses in all the years that we had in Baltimore.
When all those promoters initially banded together, basically to stop Vince from taking over the wrestling world, as you alluded to, I just imagine how might wrestling history have been different had they not all splintered off. Had they really decided to band together to take out, the guy that was basically in their minds trying to put them all out of business, if they had just been able to close ranks and almost form sort of like the old National Wrestling Alliance, where the promoters all work together and don't step on each other. I wonder if they could have been able to hold off Vince from his, grand plans of national expansion, which obviously he eventually was successful in. So I just wonder about, had they not all had, egos or whatever get in the way. I mean, do you think it could have worked had they agreed to all stick together?
We will never know. We, of course, did end up with a major, competitor, so to speak, to Vince, and that was WCW.
Sure.
And of course, that WCW died due to corporate decisions, nothing to do with wrestling or wrestling promoters, but due to AOL and other stories that we've talked about. Could it have worked with the promoters getting together? Who knows? Who knows?
All right, let me go to our next question. This is from Rich, and he says, do you see any way kayfabe could have survived until today? Did the internet destroy it, or could we have continued to live in a world where fans chose to suspend their disbelief? That's a great question. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think fans still suspend their disbelief to some extent, just the way they do when they watch a movie. If the work is good enough in the ring, there will be some suspension of disbelief. If you recall, Vince McMahon went public in large part to try and deregulate from state athletic commissions and get out from under them, and he was very successful in that. He went out, I think it was probably in the mid '90s. I think before the internet was as ubiquitous as it is today. And Vince basically told it as it was, and many states did deregulate, and if they didn't, they underregulated. So he was quite successful in that effort, and that got a lot of publicity. And then, of course, with the internet, everything it's open season, and whether it's wrestling or anything else. So everything's exposed on the internet, and I don't think we could have. I do not think kayfabe could have survived today. But as I said, I do think when the work is really crisp, as in the pure tournament and in other things, I think people can very much suspend their disbelief.
I think the point that was raised in the question there about the internet destroying it, I do think that was a big part of it. Of course, as you said before that, even Vince McMahon basically admitted what everyone mostly, knew. But even so, I think kayfabe, even after he admitted that, I think kayfabe still survived to a great extent, especially because you still had the NWA around and Mid-South and other promotions at that time. And I think they basically said, well, maybe that's what Vince McMahon, maybe that's his wrestling, but what we do here is the real thing. And so I think there was still some suspension of disbelief. I think what really killed it later, though, is not just the internet, but with the internet, people were exposed more, I think, to the sheet writers and the sheets. And I think just from there became this perception that there were, and maybe it was a reality, that there were more smart fans than there had ever been before. And that led to the promotions themselves. In the way they told their stories, they were sometimes told with a read between the lines and a wink and a nod that this is a work. And a lot of times you would have these quote unquote worked shoot storylines where it was basically, okay, we know everyone's in on it and everything on the show's a work except this one angle. This is real. And I think that really was once the promotions themselves admit to it and change the way they do storylines where it's, admitting basically it's all a work except certain things, I think that was truly the final nail in the coffin for kayfabe.
Yeah, I agree. And wrestling in many ways kind of mirrored society in general. You started to have 24-hour news on cable. So you had a lot of former print journalists now becoming TV personalities. And in wrestling, you had these, quote, sheet writers now becoming internet personalities and having podcasts. And then you had talent breaking kayfabe and starting to do shoot interviews and things along those lines. So just like everything else in society that was on the internet, wrestling was as well. And it's very hard to keep secrets and kayfabe in that environment. So, and to your point, sure, I think even to this day, it's, fans, there's I think Cody Rhodes once described it as that mixture between truth and fiction, and where's the truth and where's the fiction. So that's kind of an interesting part of the way the business has evolved, where people are still looking for a reason to believe, even if it's not so much what happens in the ring, but maybe in some of the stories that are being told.
Exactly. And I think you hit the nail on the head there, is that people do still want to believe, which is encouraging. Before we move on to the next question, I want to just one other thing I wanted to bring up on this subject. Did you ever see the clip that's out on YouTube of Bob Roop, Bob Orton Jr., Boris Malenko, all basically giving these interviews for a TV news station where they're admitting that the business is a work because they were in a war with the local promoter? Are you familiar with that clip?
I am not. Bob Roop was at our very first show in Baltimore, was actually one of the agents working with Ole from Georgia Championship Wrestling. But no, I am unfamiliar with that clip. When exactly was that, and who were the warring promotions?
I'd have to go back and look again at what the promotions were, but it never aired. It was basically a threat by Bob Roop that he was going to expose the business.
Okay.
And these interviews were taped where they all said, this is my real name. I'm a performer. I've never had an actual legitimate pro wrestling match in my life. I've never had a match where the winner wasn't predetermined. There's no such thing. But it never ended up airing, although the clip has found its way onto YouTube, as pretty much everything does. But I'll have to send you that clip, and maybe that's a topic for something we could bring up on a future episode.
Well, another one that found its way onto the internet that I have seen was that in around 86 at a show in Oakland, California that I did with Jim Crockett Promotions, Jimmy Garvin had a video recorder. They were kind of a new toy back in those days. And he had one in the dressing room, and all the guys were talking into the video recorder, totally breaking kayfabe. And it never got out then, but it's seen often now. Several people have sent it to me over the past few years.
Yeah, I've seen that one. Amazing. I mean, that these things resurface after all this time.
Yes, it is. I don't know where they find them, but it is pretty amazing that some of these obscure things from way back then, will pop up.
Let me throw another question at you. This one comes from Chris. He says, the word from those involved claim that the tag team division of Jim Crockett Promotions, which included the Rock and Roll Express, the Midnight Express, and the Road Warriors, ultimately drew more money than the World Championship matches during the Great American Bash years. During that period of time, did you find this to be true, or would you have a higher gate when putting the World Championship match on top of the card, as was traditionally done? That's another great question.
Yeah, I don't. It really depends on the whole card. The first sellout we ever had in Baltimore had Flair and Dusty on top, world title, with Flair having the title and Dusty challenging. And it had the Road Warriors and the Russians in a cage. So it's a double main event. So which one drew more money? Well, the house was sold out because of both of those matches.
Right.
One of the things that was different back then, and you're of course very familiar with this, and probably so are most of the listeners. But back then, it was very common with Jim Crockett Promotions and others to run more than one show per night.
Sure.
They were usually running 2 shows per night. And what would happen in the Crockett's, they would often go to the smaller towns with the Rock and Roll and Midnight on top as the main event. And they drew huge in all these smaller markets. And that was really all they needed in those markets. So you might have a big town running, and you'd have, Dusty and Flair and those guys there, but the Rock and Roll Midnight were so hot that they could draw on their own in the secondary town. So to try and figure out where the money was and what drew more, tag matches or world title matches, there were way more tag matches. They had a 6-man championship. They had, like I say, the Rock and Roll and the Midnights feud. They had all kinds of other great, tag feuds. It said, like, as you mentioned, the Road Warriors and the Russians were huge for a long time. So that's a hard question to answer. But I think in those days, both of them were, in that era of the Crockett's, business was just really good. And the talent pool there was amazing. Besides the people we just mentioned, there was Wahoo, and there was Magnum TA, before his injury, of course, and Tully Blanchard, and Arn Anderson and Barry Windham. It was just a phenomenal talent base. So those were the kind of the golden years before it all came to an end.
Absolutely. And guys like Sting and Lex Luger, of course, also part of that. I mean, it was just an incredible roster. And as a testament to that, as you said, you could have the Rock and Roll Express and the Midnight Express go to one of the smaller markets, and it was on fire, sold out everywhere they went. So you didn't have to necessarily have Ric Flair go into these towns to get sellouts. But let me ask a follow-up question to that. Gimmick matches, steel cage matches, things of that nature. Did you notice that they actually did help increase the attendance, or was there not much difference in your recollection, from what you recall?
Steel cage matches, definitely.
Okay.
Part of it was because it was a cage and people knew they were going to see blood. And also because oftentimes it was a blow off to a big angle. So, it was the culmination, but steel cages, yes. And they often provided, a great kind of venue within the venue for a really good match. Other gimmick matches like the scaffold matches, the Skywalker matches, they drew until somebody saw one and the word got out, because they were awful. They were really awful. There was very little they could do up on a scaffold. And it was, very sensationalistic. And I think they probably did draw to some extent, but not like a cage match, which, as I say, was a blow-off match, and was just, that's cage matches were definitely something that would add to a card.
Yeah, and I guess you also had to be cognizant, right, not to do it too many times. You had to really sort of pick and choose. If you do a cage match every month, then it's not special anymore.
Oh, absolutely, and that's true with any kind of gimmick match like that. You really had to save them for special occasions, or they wouldn't be special anymore.
Right. He made a great point about the scaffold match, though, because I think you're right. It sounds great. It sounds like, oh my God, these guys are fighting on top of this scaffold, high up in the air, and it doesn't end till they're. I think they used to basically say thrown off the scaffold, but that never happened. Obviously, somebody could seriously get hurt. It was mainly they would hang underneath and drop down, which still was dangerous. Just ask Jim Cornette, who blew out both knees doing it. But they looked great in the magazines. I remember, I think the first one might have been done in Memphis. And you just see these guys up on this scaffold, and there was like a wide shot. So you see how high up they are. Like, wow, man, this is amazing. And then you hear about it in the promotion for it, the Night of the Skywalkers, Road Warriors and the Midnight Express. And it's like, man, this just sounds amazing. But you're right. Because of the safety issue, there's not much you can do up there. So everyone's very tentative and moving around very gingerly. And yeah, they're just not good. I know there was one in Baltimore. I don't remember all the participants, but I'm pretty sure Stunning Steve Austin was in it. I think it was at one of the Great American Bashes, and it held the tradition of the scaffold matches. It was not good.
Yeah, and gingerly is just not a word that was ever used to describe the Road Warriors.
Exactly right. Before we wrap up, I want to ask you one more question. This is coming from me, actually. You mentioned earlier when we were talking about Pro Wrestling USA, the name Eddie Einhorn. Now, that might be a name that wrestling fans aren't familiar with. Baseball fans might be, old school baseball fans. Could you just talk a little bit about Eddie Einhorn and what his role was in professional wrestling?
I could talk about Eddie Einhorn for a long time, because he's one of the most interesting people I ever met, and I got to know him quite well and work with him for several years. Eddie was a law school graduate from Northwestern University in 1961 with Jerry Reinsdorf, and then the two of them later reconnected to purchase the White Sox and the Bulls in Chicago. Eddie was the first person to package college basketball and make the Final Four in March Madness what it is today. Back in the 60s, there was virtually no college basketball on television other than maybe something in a local market. Eddie was the first one to actually do that, and it landed him a job as president of CBS Sports when he was still in his 20s. So he was like a child prodigy that way, and he always loved wrestling. And Eddie had the idea, kind of, so to speak, before Vince, where he was going to go national with wrestling. And in 1975, he formed the IWA, the International Wrestling Association, and signed to big contracts, many big stars, Ivan Koloff and Tex McKenzie and Mil Mascaris, and
I think Mill was the champion, I believe.
Yeah, on and on, a whole big roster of talent. And it was a big failure. He didn't know the wrestling business. Pedro Martinez, who had been the booker in Buffalo for many years, was his booker. And it just didn't work. They were not able to really crack any markets. The biggest show they ever had was in Roosevelt Stadium, I think in 1975, because they couldn't get into any of the buildings that WWF had in New York. And then they tried to get into the Carolinas and the Crockett territories, and most of those buildings kept them out. And the other promoters would run, they'd get together and run big shows the same night. And it only lasted a year or two. And I didn't know Eddie back then. I met Eddie through Vern Gagne, in this whole Pro Wrestling USA effort in the 80s. And Eddie was just a fascinating guy. He'd become very wealthy and he loved wrestling. He would go to Japan by himself and go to wrestling shows. He would travel all over the country. He wouldn't tell anybody. He'd just go buy a ticket. He just loved wrestling. So his chance, to do something in it again was a lot of fun for him. He used to call me every night at about 11 o'clock. And I was married then, and my then wife was a school teacher, and she got up early, but I had to keep the phone, the ringer on, because Eddie would call around 11 or 11 o'clock, and we'd talk for an hour every night. And he was a larger than life personality and just a real character.
I guess it just goes to show, though, that maybe the takeaway from that is no matter how much you love the business or maybe how entrepreneurial you may be, that at the end of the day, if you don't really understand the wrestling business and you're trying to compete with guys like Vince McMahon and Jim Crockett and so forth, it's really a losing proposition to try to do so.
It was for Eddie, exactly as you described. But he had a good time doing it, and like I say, came back and worked with us when we put together those Meadowlands shows in '84 and '85.
All right, well, Gary, that is all the time we have for today. It was great to we had a little bit of a backlog of the questions, so it was good that we got to some of them today. We'll do probably another show like this in the future. Mainly we'll focus on one subject, but we'll devote other shows to the Ask Gary format. If anyone does have a question for Gary for a future episode, you can submit that question using the hashtag AskGary on Twitter. You can also submit the question on Ring of Honor's Facebook page. I want to thank everyone out there for listening. If you're a fan of the show, please spread the word about Old School in Session. For Gary Juster, this is Kevin Eck, and Old School is out. Until next week.